You guys know what today is? No. Seriously, do you know what today is? I don't anymore. Is it Wednesday, Monday, Thursday? It's suspension day. You guys remember last time I talked a little bit about the Rock Krawler Pro X 3-inch no limit suspension I'm going to be installing on my Gladiator. Well, I've got everything laid out here, organized and ready to start my install. Of course, you remember I had all the control arms custom powder coated in this anodized red finish. If you just get them out of the box from Rock Krawler, they're going to be in a black finish, just like the rest of the components here on the skid. Of course, I've got all the control arms set up, shocks, bump stops, bump stop extensions, sway bar links over there, as well as that rear truss for the rear axle for that 4-link setup, and new spring isolators. The springs are still in the box. I'm going to get those unpacked in just a few minutes. Of course, there's a couple things I want to take care of before I get the install underway. We've got to take some baseline measurements so we can do a little before and after comparison, of course, with the new suspension installed. All right, with those factory measurements taken, I can go ahead and start setting up the lengths of all my control arms to the specification that Rock Krawler outlines here in their instructions. So I've got my front lower control arms here I can get started with. Of course, I've already got all the bushings and everything set up. I already greased everything up with some anti-seize in here, so I'm not going to worry about it. And I also got a couple bolts. I drew a little line on there with a Sharpie, and these are just going to help make it a little bit easier to take a good center line measurement from each one of the ends of the arm. So you can see right now I've got 24 1/8. I need to be at 24 5/8 on the front lower arms for a 3-inch suspension. Yeah, 24 1/2, a little more to go. And 24 5/8 looks pretty good to me. The other thing that these bolts are going to help me do, if I set these on the table, well, I can take the bolts, put them through the one arm that's already set, and then I can put them together to ensure that I'm going to get the exact same length out of both arms. It's a pretty easy way to make sure that both are identical to start. There we go. With both front lower control arms set, I'll go ahead and run these jam nuts down just finger tight for right now. Then I can go ahead and get the Jeep up in the air on the lift and start getting that factory stuff torn out. Now with the lower control arm out of the way, Rock Krawler recommends we cut a small relief here in the top of the lower control arm mount on the axle side. It's going to allow a little more room for that control arm to flex, and it's going to give us access to that grease fitting up on top of the control arm end link here. Now Rock Krawler recommends we use a hole saw. It's going to be an easy way to get a nice clean cut here on top of the control arm mount. Now with the track bar set in place, I've got the bolt in up on the frame side. I've got to wait until the Jeep's back down on the ground to align and install the bolt here on the axle side of the track bar. I've also got to wait to tighten the lower control arm axle side bushings and the lower bolts on the shocks until it's back on the ground. But other than that, we're pretty much wrapped up at the front here. All the control arms are in place, springs, shocks, bump stops, sway bar end links. So at this point, it's it's time to work on the rear. So at this point, I've got the rear of the Gladiator completely torn down, and I mean completely. I've got the entire rear axle sitting here with me. Now, at this point, I'm ready to begin installing some new components, but before I get to that, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Rock Krawler system. Now, it's converting the rear suspension from a traditional 5-link that uses lower control arms, upper control arms, and a rear track bar or panhard bar to a triangulated 4-link system. Now, just a little bit about suspension types here. With a traditional 5-link, of course, we've got lower control arms, upper control arms, basically in line. And if we didn't have that track bar in place, well, the axle could move kind of all over the place underneath of the truck. So the job of the track bar, of course, attached to the axle and the frame here, is going to keep that axle planted and keep it from moving laterally. Of course, as the suspension cycles, well, the axle is going to shift underneath of the truck, but it's going to be held in place with the track bar. Now, Rock Krawler is converting to a triangulated 4-link system using this really cool bolt-on truss here that's going to sit on top of the axle. So you can see we're moving our upper control arm mounts from out here out wide in line with the lower control arm mounts all the way in here towards the center of the axle on this truss. By doing that, well, that means we can ditch this track bar because these two upper links are now going to keep that axle centered under the truck. Now, with the links triangulated, of course, they're not going to be able to move, and we're eliminating a ton of bind in the rear suspension, and it's going to allow for awesome amounts of flex with this kit. Now, I will say that this truss is a bolt-in style truss. It's going to use 4 existing bosses here on the center differential, and then a pair of large U-bolts that are going to install around the axle tubes to hold this in place. Now, you can simply bolt this in and run it with no problems at all. However, Rock Krawler does recommend, if you're going to be running larger than a 37-inch tire, or if you plan on doing some really hardcore type off-roading, that you actually go ahead and weld the truss to the axle tubes as well. Now, I'm a big fan of only doing a job one time, and since I've got the entire axle assembly sitting with me here outside of the truck, it's going to be really easy to work on. I'm going to go ahead and weld the truss in place here on the axle. Of course, I'm only running a 37-inch tire right now, so I would be within the specifications set by Rock Krawler, but like I mentioned, with it out, with ease of access, it just makes sense to go ahead and weld it right now. Now, before I get to that, there is one other step I need to do. The 4 bosses on top of the differential here do need to be drilled out, enlarged to a 1/2 inch, and then tapped for the new hardware. So I'm going to get started with that. see, we've got everything installed here in the rear end, and we no longer have the need for the rear track bar. So as far as I'm concerned, we can pretty much get rid of that at this point. We've got this truss on top of the axle now that's got our upper control arms triangulated here, making that triangulated 4-link, so our lower control arms are still nice and wide out here. Those upper control arms are angled way into the center of the axle. Now, I actually took a quick measurement when I got everything bolted in, and the axle was actually shifted just a little bit driver's side. So to shift the axle to the passenger side, I went ahead and lengthened up the driver's side upper control arm and shortened the passenger side control arm, which in effect pulled that axle to the passenger side of the truck. Of course, everything is installed now. The sway bar links are in place. Coils, you want to pay close attention to make sure that you put the taller coil spacer here on the passenger side. The shorter spacer goes on the driver's side. Shocks are all bolted in. At this point, the only thing left to do is to go ahead and get the brake calipers reinstalled, drop the truck down on the ground, and get the wheels and tires installed. Wow, I think that makes a huge improvement to my truck. Overall, I can't wait to get out on the road, see how that triangulated 4-link handles on my daily drive, and then I'm definitely going to be looking forward to getting out on the trails to see how this Rock Krawler kit really performs. Now, at the beginning, before we did any work to the truck, I got a measurement of 39¼ inches from the ground to the bottom edge of the fender, and that measurement was actually pretty consistent all the way around the truck. At this point, with the 37s and that Rock Krawler Pro X 3-inch lift, I'm now measuring 44½ inches to the bottom of the fenders. Again, pretty consistent all the way around the truck. So that's an even amount of 5 inches of lift all the way around. I think it looks absolutely great, again, with those 37s. I can't wait to get this thing out on the road and the trail. If you guys haven't already, do me a favor, make sure you subscribe, so you'll catch all of the latest from us here at Quadratec. I've got plenty more for you guys coming with my truck, as well as much, much more. Till next time, I'm Rob. I'll see you guys out on the trail.